Well, dear friends, this parasha that we just read was Parashat Tetzaveh, and it was also Shabbat Zachor, which is the Shabbat right before the festival of Purim, and it was also the beginning of the second U.S.-Israel-Iran war. So during the day, we had 10 to 11 sirens that went off that we had to go into the bomb shelters. It continued into the night and this morning. And we are hoping that the end of this war will bring peace to the region and regime change in Iran, first and foremost, of course, for the benefit of the Iranian people, who close to 80%, according to the polls, are fed up with this violent and extremist regime. And also, of course, for the peace of the people of Israel, because we have been led into attacks from Iran through their proxies for over 2 years now, since October 7, 2023. And really, this has been a war that Iran instigated and supported and trained people. And so, in a sense, the victory over the regime will be not just freedom for the Iranian people, but also the culmination, in a sense, of this over 2 year war between the Iran Islamic regime and the state of Israel, which hopefully will put an end to this Islamic regime and its violence. Having said that, we look forward towards peace. We look forward towards cooperation with the new Iran, hopefully in the Abraham Accords. And to all our neighbors, we always extend peace and the desire to live together. There's a reason why our army is called the Defense Force, because we're there to defend. We're never there to instigate. I'll leave it at that. So, dear friends, I want to talk about Parashat Tetzaveh. And then I'll relate it also to Purim. Parashat Tetzaveh starts off with the clothing of the Kohanim. Now, I want to start by, and of course, it's the clothing for the Kohanim in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan, the sanctuary that was built in the desert. There's an interesting statement from next week's parsha, actually, about Bezalel, who is the architect of the Mishkan, who was chosen by Moses and God, according to next week's parsha. And it says, Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, this is taken from the Talmud Brachot, page 9. Yodea haya Betzalel etzaref otiyot shenivruhu behem shamayim va'aretz, which means Betzalel knew the permutations of letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which were needed in order to create the heavens and the earth. As you may know, both according to the Midrash Rabbah, and according to the mystical work Sefer Yetzirah, God created the universe through the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. In fact, in the Sefer Yetzirah, it says the 22 letters and the 10 sefirot, which probably originally meant the numbers from 1 to 10 or 1 to 9, according to Vilna Gaon. Let's say 1 to 10. And then later on, according to the Kabbalists, it became the special emanations, the Sefirot, the divine emanations. But why would Bezalel need to know the secrets of the creation of the universe in order to build a building, which would become the sanctuary? Well, there are different approaches to this. There's also Midrash Teman, which also brings a Midrash making comparison between the creation of the universe and verses tied to the Mishkan in our week's chapters, into the of course the building of the Mishkan, the building of the sanctuary. So, and there are those like the Malbim, Meir Leibush Malbim, writing in the beginning of the second half of the 19th century, that you can make a comparison between the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the human body. It's almost like it's a reflection of the human being or of mankind. A very interesting idea brought by the Malbim. I'm not going to go into every detail because he literally goes into anatomical details of the human body and comparisons to the Mishkan, but I'll just give a little overview of his ideas. You have the innermost part of the sanctuary, which is called Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Holy of Holies. There you have the Aron, which is the Ark of the Covenant, and inside the Ark of the Covenant, you have the two tablets. So the Ark then would be, of course, the Kodesh HaKodeshim would be the head. The Ark would be the skull, and the tablets would be the right and left brain. There's the right tablet and the left tablet. And then there is a partition which separates between the Holy of Holies and the oracle, the Heichal, the middle section. And that partition, according to the Malbim, is the neck, which separates the head from the rest of the body. And then in the oracle, in the Heichal, you have the menorah, the candelabra. That represents the wisdom of the heart. This is actually a word which we find both in this week's parsha and last week's parsha and the coming week's parsha. It says, "Belev kol chacham lev natati chochma." In the heart of all those who have the wisdom of the heart have I given wisdom. So there's the wisdom of the mind and the wisdom of the heart, which is a certain maybe sensitivity or moral wisdom. So that's the menorah. The incense altar represents the lungs, because incense is something you breathe in. And the shulchan, the showbread table, represents the stomach. And again, the partition between the oracle, or the heichal, and the azara, the outer section of the temple, is another, of course, curtain. And this represents the diaphragm, which separates the middle of the abdomen. Everything under the abdomen, the diaphragm, represents the outside of the temple, the outside of the temple, where you have the outer altar, and only there do you have the animal sacrifices, and it represents the lower part of man, which is also something which we share with the animal kingdom. So this is according to Malbim, how in a way the Mishkan reflects the human being. But if the Mishkan reflects the human being and then reflects mankind or the people of Israel, who are the Kohanim? Who are the priests, according to this analogy? The ones that we're talking about that God tells Moses how to make their clothes. So the answer would be, we, the Jewish people. After all, it says, V'yitem li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. God says to Moses, tell the Jewish people, you will be to me a priestly people and a holy nation. You'll be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the Jewish people are the meaning of the metaphor when you look at the Kohanim, who are actually Kohanim, representing the people, of course, inside the sanctuary. So what does this all mean? And why the specifics of garments? What is the meaning of the garments that the Kohanim have to wear? So let's take a look in general at what the meaning of any garment is. Why do we wear clothing? So I would say logically we wear clothing for three reasons. Reason number one, of course, is the most obvious. It can be cold in the winter. It could be, the sun can be burning in the summer. So you need clothing for protection. Like it says in Devarim, when God took us through the desert for 40 years, Simlatcha lo valtami alecha, which means your clothing did not go bad because there was no place to wash it. V'raglecha lo batzeka, and you didn't get blisters on your feet. Ze 40 shana, over those 40 years. Miraculously, God helped you to keep your clothing because you needed that clothing as protection against the environment. So that's the first reason for clothing. And I think that's, in a sense, the most logical one. The second reason, of course, is given already in the book of Genesis, and it's also logical. We wear clothing as a separation of the sexes because it's a question of tzniut, of modesty, because human beings in their hard drive, they have an attraction between the sexes. And somehow the clothing is able to help them as a defense mechanism. I would always say to look at the opposite sex not as an object, but as a human being. And we have this, of course, already in the story in Genesis of the Garden of Eden, as Maimonides points out in chapter 2 of part 1 of his Moreh Nevuchim. So Adam and Eve are in Gan Eden and they are naked, but this does not make them ashamed because they don't see the problem with their nakedness. They don't feel any particular attraction. It doesn't seem to be something which is that important. And then after they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, all of a sudden they look at each other, they realize they're naked and they are ashamed. And God says that when God talks to Adam, he says, "Why are you hiding?" And Adam says, "Because I realize that I'm naked." God says, "How did you realize that you're naked? Did you take from that tree?" I don't want to go into the details of how Maimonides explains this. It's a wonderful chapter in the Guide for Perplexed. I just want to say that in the Hebrew language, we have two words for garments which come from this story. One is the word levush, which is a garment. And just as you have the Hebrew word, it says that Adam and Eve were not ashamed, velo yitboshashu. So therefore they had garments, levush, for the busha, which means shame. And the second word we have in Hebrew is begadim, which comes from the root boged, which is a traitor, an act of treason against God, that God said not to eat from just that one tree, but Adam and Eve did so despite the warning. So these are words in the Hebrew language which remind us of the story of Adam and Eve. So that's the second aspect of garments, and wearing garments, of course, becomes this act of modesty. And then the third part of a garment, or lack of sometimes, and then the third part of a garment is it can signify status when you wear certain garments. It can also be a role that a person has. It can also be an honor. We see this, of course, in the Kohanim. It says that their garments were lechavod uletiferet, for honor and for glory. Many of the Parshanim say it's for the honor and the glory of God, as they are the representing, of course, God and the people in the sanctuary. But also in the people's eyes, it also gives them a certain status. When you wear clothing, people look at you sometimes differently. That's why in every court case, when a person has a court case, they tell them, put on your best suit, or a woman, put on your fanciest dress and go in there, and then they'll think you're a significant person, because very often the clothing makes the person in the eyes of the other. It's interesting that the Talmud in Shabbat tells a story, and it's about this issue of clothing. Talmud says, Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Asi were sitting before Rabbi Yochanan, who was, I guess, their teacher. And we're talking in the first century in the third century, which was the first generation of Amoraic scholars in the land of Israel. And Rabbi Yochanan Kamanamnem, he was sort of like dozing. And I guess they woke him up. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Asi said to him, Mipnei ma talmidei chachamim shebabavel mitzuyanim. Why is it that the scholars, remember they lived in the land of Israel, why is it that the scholars in Babylonia, the Jewish scholars in Babylonia, wear such fancy clothes? Rabbi Yochanan looked at them and says, because they're not really scholars, so at least their clothes make them look like rabbis or scholars. right? The clothing sometimes can make the man. You can understand there's a little bit of comedy in this and a little bit of humor in his answer. But it's true that very often in people's eyes, it is the clothing that makes the man. This is not necessarily bad if you use it in the proper way. So for the Kohanim, by wearing this regalia, this fancy clothing, specifically the high priest, it impresses the people, and there is a certain value to that used in the right way. Now let's talk about the begadim. Let's talk about the clothing of the Cohen. So for the regular Cohen, aside from the high priest, for the regular Cohen, there are 4 pieces of clothing. One is a kutonet, which is sort of like a vest or an upper garment. Then there's a mikbat, which is a hat. The michnas seibad, which is like short pants made out of linen that he wears underneath this tunic. And then there's a sash. Altogether, you have, that's the avneit, a sash. So altogether, that's 4. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, has 8, because in addition to this 4, he has another 4. And altogether, you have the choshen and the ephod, which is sort of like an apron, and on top of that, there's the breastplate. And he also has the tzitz, which is like a golden crown that he wears around his hat. And he also has the tashbetz, which is also linked to something which he is wearing, sort of like, so there's the choshen, the ephod, and the tashbetz also, which he wears in addition. So altogether, they have 8. He has 8 pieces of clothing. Now, when we look at this, 4 and 8, we can see a number line here. Starting from 0, you have 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8. Well, if we continue the number line, we also see a significance, because 3 times 4 is 12. And 12, of course, represent the 12 stones which were on the breastplate of the high priest. So we now find significance in our number line, going from 1 times 4 to 2 times 4 is 8, and to 3 times 4 is 12. The question is, what will be 4 times 4, which of course would be 4 squared, which would give us a cube. Well, the first thing I want to say is, what is the meaning of 4? If we look among the Greeks, as early as Pythagoras, Plato, and of course, Euclid, the founder of geometry, of linear geometry. So 1 dot doesn't really exist. 2 dots is a line, 3 dots is a triangle, 4 dots is a square. So on the one hand, 4 becomes a square. We also know that in antiquity, in biblical times, clothing were like ponchos, there were squares. Just like the breastplate is a square, and upon which the breastplate is put is also a square. And if you actually look at the tunic of the Kohanim, it sort of looks like a square. So, and it says in the Torah, in Devarim, Gedilim taselecha al arba kanfot kesutecha. You should have things dangling, which of course is the tzitzit, on the 4 corners of your garment, sort of like tassels, I think sometimes they call it. So these are the tzitzit that we wear, because the garments were 4-cornered, because they were squared. Now, what does then the 4 represent? It represents, in a sense, the human initiative in nature. Why is that? And I will quote Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel in the Talmud Yerushalmi Nidarim, page 3, chapter 3, Mishnah 2. He says, Ein meruba misheshet yemei breshit, which actually means there are no squares in nature. In nature, you find a lot of round things, like all the planets. You also find some triangles, like in quartz crystals, but you will not find squares. Squares are of human initiative. So in a sense, the square represents human initiative, just like it did in the garments in the time of old. Another interesting thing about the square, if you look at the Mishkan The Midrash, and the Midrash says this in the Midrash Rabbah, there are three things in the Mishkan which have a crown, which is called Zer Zahav, the golden crown, which goes around it, and goes around it in a square, despite the fact that we think of a crown always as round because it sits on the head of a human being. But the head of a human being is part of nature, and that's why it's round, of course. Like our bodies are round on the outside also. So, so the first one, which has the crown, of course, is the Ark of the Covenant. And the second one is the Shulchan, the showbread table, which is also square, like the Ark of the Covenant. And the third one is the Mizbach HaKetoret, the incense altar in the middle section of the tabernacle, which is also square. And these three ktarim, these three crowns, square crowns at the top of each one of these items, represents the three crowns of the Ark of the Covenant represents the crown of Torah, of the Torah and scholarship. And the incense altar is the crown of Kehunah, of priesthood. And the third altar, which is the Shulchan, the showbread table representing wealth, is the crown of royalty. These are the three crowns also mentioned in Pirkei Avot, and all these items are square. And of course, the outer altar is also square. The tabernacle itself is square. So square represents things that are built in this world. But what specifically are garments? Garments are something that cover us. All the three reasons I gave were different reasons for why we cover ourselves. But in the end of the day, garments cover us. For what extent is whatever the culture is, but they cover. Because garments are something to cover, we find a very interesting midrash in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer about God's garments. And the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer in chapter 3 says, Shamayim me'ef ze makom nivrau. Where were the heavens created from? And the answer they give, Me'or levusho shel kadosh baruch hu. From the light of God's clothing. He took his clothing, lakach mimenu, ufares kesalman, he stretched it out like a garment. Vayu motchim in it, and he kept stretching and continuing. Ad shamar lehem dai, until he told his garment to stop. And therefore, one of God's names is Shaddai, which is Shamar L'Olamo Dai. He told his world, or in this case, the garment, to stop. And the heavens stopped. Uminayin shema'or levushon ivran. How do you know that the world was created or the heavens were created from God's garment? Because it says in Tehillim, in Psalms 104:2, Ote or kasalma. God envelops himself in light, just like a garment. Noteh shamayim kayirya, and he also makes the heavens stand just like a cloth separation. So, what does this mean that God has garments? What it means is, as I said, a garment is something to hide yourself. And therefore, when the Midrash says that God has a garment, it means God has to hide. What does God hide from? From us? Because if God reveals himself to us too much, we lack free will to make the decisions that we have to make as moral beings in this world, as autonomous beings. Therefore, God must hide. So when he creates the world, he hides. As the prophet Isaiah says, Achen ata el mistater, you are definitely a hiding God, a hidden God. Elohei Yisrael Moshiach, the God of Israel who brings salvation. And it also said, now there is a verse in the book of Mishle and Proverbs, says, Hashem b'chokhmah yasad eretz. God created the universe with chokhmah, with wisdom. And also, if you look at the first verse of Genesis, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created. So there's a Targum of Yerushalmi, there's an Aramaic translation, which is called Targum Yerushalmi, and there it explains, what does it mean, in the beginning God created? It says, in wisdom God created the universe. The same thing that we find in the book of Proverbs, in the book of Mishle. Now, in Kabbalistic literature, of course, I mentioned before, God creates the universe through the letters, and specifically through the most potent of letters, which are God's names. And you have what's called the Tetragrammaton, the main name of God, which is a meditative name. It's never pronounced, it's just thought, because it's letters without vowels. And in this four-letter name of God, according to the Kabbalists, the first one, the Yud, which is the catalyst of the creation, represents Chokhmah, wisdom. As we said before, God creates the universe out of wisdom, through his word, his logos, his wisdom. And so if the Yud represents creating the world out of wisdom, what's the Hey Vav Hey? What's the rest of it? And by the way, the Hey Vav Hey in the Tetragrammaton is the word Hoveh, which means presence, meaning from the void he creates a presence. The presence is human consciousness, which is at the base, at consciousness in general, which is the base of reality. But what is Hey Vav Hey? It's this world. So the Yud represents Chokhmah, or the highest world, Atzilut. And through this, he creates the Hey Vav Hey, the three lower worlds, Bria, Yetzirah, Vasiyah. And he has to enclose himself within these worlds so that we don't see that he's there, but he's there all the time. He peeks through the cracks, as it says in the Song of Songs. He stands on the other side of the curtain, of the veil, looking from a distance. Omed achar kotlenu, standing on the other side of our wall. Mashgiach min hachalonot, looking through the windows, as it says in the Song of Songs. Mitzitz micharakim, and peeking through the cracks. Because that's what God does. He veils himself in this world, and that's why it says in Pirkei Rebbe Lezer that God created the universe through his clothing, because clothing is to unveil you. So this is the idea. And therefore we come up with the 16, because Hey Vav Hey, 5, 6, 5, that's Hey Vav Hey, comes out to 16. So 16, which is 4, so you have 4, the garments of the Cohen, 8, the garments of the high priest, 12, the precious stones on the breastplate, representing the tribes of Israel, and 16 represent how God hides himself as if through a garment so that we shouldn't see him. That's the ultimate garment, which is called four squared, which is a cube, and God is hiding himself within this garment as if. On Purim, by the way, usually Parashat Tetzaveh usually comes around Purim time. And in Purim, we have the scroll of Esther. In Hebrew, the scroll of Esther is Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther. But it's also, you can make a play on words because it's the same root. Megillah is the same root as Legalot, which means to reveal. Esther is the same root as Seter, which is hidden. So the scroll of Esther can be understood to mean to reveal that which is hidden. And what is hidden in the scroll of Esther? God's name, because it's not there. At the most, it is hinted to. Like, say, chapter 4, where Mordechai says to Esther, and if you decide to hide yourself in the king's palace at a time like this, after the decree of Haman, salvation shall come to the Jewish people from another place, which is God. And so this becomes the secret of Megillat Esther, that even in the Galut, even in the diaspora, when we are in the exile, God is still watching over us. The divine presence is always with Israel. This past Shabbat was called Shabbat Zachor, where we remember Amalek, this nation who was actually a relative. Unfortunately, a lot of our enemies in biblical times were relatives, because Amalek was a son of Eliphaz, the son of Esau. So definitely a relative, son of Esau and Timnah. Oh, excuse me, Eliphaz and Timnah. So he's a grandson of Esau. And they just attacked the Jews as if for nothing. We came out of Egypt, the Israelites, and they, out of nowhere, they weren't even living in that area. Eventually, they pitched some tents in the south, but they had come as if from nowhere just to attack us. And God tells Moses to fight Amalek, and Aaron and Hur are holding up Moses' hands. And this we read in the book of Exodus. And at the end of that story in Exodus, God says, Ki yad al kesiyah, God's hand is on his throne, to tell us, meaning he takes an oath, that there will always be a fight against Amalek in every generation. Now, today we don't have Amalek because it was a nation which disappeared in antiquity, but we understand this to mean that we have to remember this, which is always verbally. We have to remember this every year because we have to know that there's always those who are trying to destroy us and freedom and justice and morality. Because unfortunately, the enemies of the Jews are always the ones who want to destroy freedom, justice, and morality. And the ones who love freedom, justice, and morality, they're okay with the Jews. Sometimes they even love us. But now the Talmud says an interesting thing about this, and so does the Midrash. Why does God's throne have only two letters, Kaf and Samach? Where's the Aleph? Normally Kisei, which is a chair or a throne, is usually written with three letters. Where's the Aleph? It's missing. And why in God's name, the Tetragrammaton, only the Yud Hey is used? Why not the Vav Hey? Why is it only half? So the Talmud says a famous thing, the Midrash says, because God's throne is not complete and God's name is not complete until the idea, meaning the memory of Amalek, is deleted. What is the memory of Amalek? It's this memory of hatred. Until that memory is deleted from human consciousness, God's throne will not be complete, his kingdom, and also God's name. But I want to mention another thing relating to what we said, because the word case by itself, which can still mean throne, remember a throne or a chair always has four legs, especially in antiquity. In fact, in our tradition, the four legs of God's throne represent Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David. The four supports, in a sense. So, but the word there is case. And case in Hebrew means to conceal, which means God is concealed. And he can only reveal his hand, meaning his salvation and his redemption, only after this name of Amalek is obliterated from the lexicon of the human mind. Hopefully we're going through that point now. And hopefully with the fall of the Muslim Iranian Empire that they built up for themselves, which unfortunately was based on destruction. Just in the last month, they killed over 30 to 40,000 of their own people just because they protested. So we're hoping that this will lead to a new time of hope and freedom and liberties for human beings, where they'll be able to speak their mind and talk about love instead of hate. And that again, we'll be able to see our freedoms and our peace and the pursuit of happiness of human beings. Shalom, shalom.